welcome to the ALT Annual Conference 2021. I'm Maren Deepwell, the CEO of ALT, and I'm the first to get to say hello and welcome you to our virtual conference hall. We're so thrilled to welcome so many of you here for a conference that's been 2 years in the making. And shortly, I'm going to introduce you to 3 people who've been co-chairs longer than any other co-chairs in the history of our association, which started in 1993. So I'd like to encourage you all to say hello in the chat and find your clap emoji, because I can see many of you watching, and I hope that you will help me give the warmest virtual welcome to our co-chair team, who for 2 years now have tried to get this annual conference off in the best possible way. So in a moment, I'm going to welcome Matt, Roger, and Fazana. So do please put your hands together.
Well, good morning. On behalf of all 3 of us, a very warm welcome to the ALT Conference 2021. First, let's start with some introductions. I'm Roger Emery, Head of Learning Technologies at Solent University in Southampton.
Hi everyone, I'm Fazana Latif, a Digital Learning Manager at the University of Sheffield.
Morning everyone, great to see you all or not see you. My name's Matt and I'm the Digital Learning Director at London College of Communication, which is part of the University of the Arts London. As I say, it's lovely to be here today with the three of us and Maren and the whole ALT team to welcome you to the conference. I'm sure many of you were at the conference back in 2019 in Edinburgh. And it really seems a long time ago since I stepped onto the stage there at the close of the conference to announce the 3 of us as co-chairs and also to announce that the conference would be in London for the first time. Well, we're not all in London and it's certainly not 2020, but we're here and we're ready to go. So, of course, one of the advantages of being online is that you're all at home and in your offices. And many of you have been chatting online already, but I'd encourage you now, if you haven't already, to just say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're coming from. I'm in North London and it's a glorious sunny day, and you're very welcome to share updates on the weather too, as it is, after all, a UK conference.
Thanks, Matt. I think to say the last 18 months has been challenging is a bit of an understatement. It's provided us, though, as a community, with huge opportunities. It's really accelerated adoption, and it's helped to embed learning technology practice on a wide scale. It's raised the profile of learning technology, I think it's fair to say, even with the most cynical, in a way that most of us wouldn't have imagined. At the same time, though, it has brought forward a lot of the long-standing issues or challenges that us as a community have been aware of for some time. It's highlighted limitations with technology and some of the assumptions that we make about our learners in terms of their digital literacy, their day-to-day access to technology. As ever, ALT provides us with that brilliant opportunity to reflect on all of these issues and more. I personally have been inspired by ALT since 2018, which was the first one that I attended. It'd be great if you could share in the chat when you first attended ALT. Are you a bit of an old timer like me, or is this your first one? And also let people know in the chat what you're hoping to gain out of the conference as well.
So here are some amazing statistics, and Maren, if you could put the slides up. We've got 372 participants now registered from 24 countries joining us. And in that number, we have over 30 students joining us at the conference to engage, present and debate. We also offered this year 25 scholarships, of which most went to students, and it's fantastic to have so many students involved. And thank you to our speakers who've made the effort to ensure students are included in your proposals. My thanks also to Turn It In and Out for supporting the scholarship programme. Now, looking across our sector, it is 80% HE, sorry, but we do have 20% of our attendees coming from FE and the schools sector. So a very special warm welcome to FE and schools sector. And I hope actually the digital platform and the lower cost has opened this out a little more to people who wouldn't normally be able to travel to an ALT conference, which is the advantage of being online. Now, finally, just about connections and how to get support on this side. You'll see the various ways you can connect with us through Discord, through Twitter, and all of the presentations are on StreamYard, and also where you can get help from the help desk if you have any issues with the technology. I think one of the highlights for me is the networking opportunity. This is how Matt, Fazana and myself met many, many years ago. I think my first out was 2004, something like that. So please engage in the social program as well. And don't forget the treasure hunt at 1:20 and get away from your screens. Fazana.
Thanks, Roger. So I'd just like to say some thank yous. So as well as a huge thank you. So big thank you to all of our sponsors. Without them, who really helped us to make the conference a success. And also would like to say a thank you to all of our speakers and presenters, and just all of you for attending. Throughout the conference, we've been working with a program committee, and they've provided a huge contribution in terms of planning the event and all of the social activities. And obviously a huge thanks to ALT, Maren, Emma Jane and the team who have been working tirelessly behind the scenes to make this a success. So it is time for the three of us to stop talking now. We'd all like to wish you a wonderful conference. We'll be seeing you throughout, and we're looking forward to connecting with you. And it's now over to Matt, who's going to introduce our first keynote.
Hello. For me, one of the highlights of any conference are the keynotes, and they've motivated me, entertained me, if I'm honest, sometimes annoyed me, but I've always been educated, I think. And this year we've selected keynotes, or some keynotes, that take us slightly beyond learning technology. And I'll be introducing our first keynote, Sonia, in a moment, but just wanted to look ahead. Tomorrow we'll be joined by Mutali Nkonde, who is a leading expert in race and technology, and she'll be talking to us about the structural racism that's built into algorithms and social media platforms. And then on Thursday, the focus of the keynote is joy, and I'm sure Lou will be bringing us joy in her talk that will focus on her fabulous grassroots and value-led work that she's been doing in the further education sector here in the UK. But today, to get us underway with our opening keynote, it's my great pleasure to introduce Sonia Livingstone. Sonia's going to talk for about 35 minutes, and we'll be taking questions at the end, which you can post in the chat. So as I introduce Sonia, please get your welcome emojis at the ready. Sonia is a professor of social psychology in the Department of Media and Communication at the LSE. She is, amongst other things, a prolific writer. I believe she's published 20 books now on media literacy, media audiences, and particularly children and young people's rights in the digital world. She's extremely experienced at advising public bodies, both nationally and internationally. A long list, including the UK government, the European Parliament, the UN, UNICEF, and lots more. In 2014, Sonia was awarded an OBE for her services in this field. Her current work, she is the lead for the UK's Digital Futures Commission, which I'm sure we'll be hearing about soon. So could I ask you to join me with a thunderous round of emojis and welcome our opening keynote, Professor Sonia Livingstone. Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you very, very much, Matt, for that warm welcome. And what a pleasure it is to be here today and to be the opening keynote. So I hope to raise some questions and thoughts for you today. So I've given you a slightly provocative title to get things going. And I am actually very interested in asking the question and perhaps in learning answers from everybody here today about whose interests the datafication of education is. So a few years ago, I was working on an ethnographic project which involved me spending a year with one class of year 9. Those are children aged 13 to 14. And I spent a fair bit of time sitting at the back of the class on those little chairs that get provided for children, listening to what goes on, and then later getting to know the class, working with them, being with them a little bit in the playground, sitting and having lunch with them in the school canteen. And when I'd got to know them and got a little trust, meeting their parents, going home with them, meeting their friends, hanging out on a Saturday afternoon, insofar as it's possible for a then 50-something professor to do. I did this project with Julian Sefton Green, as you can see, and the book was published as the class. So why was I sitting in the back of this classroom? Well, year 9 was told to us, described to us as the lost year, but the year in which many things happen, the year in which children become young people, perhaps the year in which they become even more embedded in a social media world, the year before the moment when GCSEs and kind of serious education results step in, but much matters. And my project was funded by a MacArthur Foundation network called the Connected Learning Research Network, which was trying to understand how technology played a part in learning today and how especially it could be used for children's kind of empowerment and agency in learning within but also beyond the school, and whether technology could take forward some of those kind of ideals of schools without walls, perhaps thinking of the openness theme of this conference. Can technology link formal with informal and non-formal learning? Can it respond to, or is it kind of locked into the problem of skill and drill learning? Is it part of, or can it provide a workaround teaching to the test, the dominance of school rankings, and so forth? So where does technology fit in, you know, whether it's a harm or a help to young people's learning, but without taking a technologically determinist approach? So we were trying very much to kind of see the whole nature of children's and young people's lives and figure out where the technology fits in, not necessarily how it leads. And just one moment from sitting at the back of that class and walking down the school corridors was, which I wanted to use to kind of kick off today, it was the omnipresence of SIMS, the school information management system, and indeed the kind of constant reference to SIMS from teachers and administrators, but also from students and parents, which to me was a little more surprising. And I was very struck by the way in which SIMS, the language of SIMS and the language of levelling and being levelled, I think the school system has changed a little since then, but the language of levelling and SIMS metrics and logics was kind of embedded discursively in the talk, in the corridor between teacher and student, between student and parent. I overheard one teacher ask a student, "Have you been levelled for art yet?" And I was thinking my old-fashioned way, not "How is your art?" or "Did you get a good grade?" or "Are you enjoying art?" but "Have you been levelled?" And I was very struck by how the technology system becomes the metaphor for kind of managing learning, and also sitting at the back of that class just watching how much time it took for the teacher to stare at the computer to enter the requisite number of data points on every child every day, rather than, as it were, standing and facing the class, or making more interactive use of the whiteboard that you can see there, that was in fact pretty much used as a one-way form of mass communication. So that really led us in the class to think about that notion, the way in which learning has become quantified and instrumentalized. And something we observed and felt critical of was the way in which, if learning could be instrumentalized, counted, leveled, then it counted, then it was kind of part of the school day. But if it couldn't fit within that system, then it was excluded, it was rendered invisible. So, for example, the child who had a German-speaking parent at home might do better at German in the school, and that could be recognized. But the child who had a Turkish speaking parent at home, that could not be recognized within the system because Turkish wasn't an official. So their skill, their knowledge was made invisible. The child who learned violin at home was recognized and got points within the system. The child who learned the saz at home, a Turkish instrument, was it didn't count, quite literally. So we were kind of developing our critique, as you can see, and our concern, until we began talking to the children and the parents and discovered how much they liked this system, how for them it was helpful to kind of know what their level was, and how they appreciated having a language for their actual level, their predicted level, their target level, their stretch level. They felt that what they were achieving was recognized by the school, was recorded by the school, was recorded in a language that everyone could communicate within, and was done so fairly. So a middle class father explained to us that the very fact and dominance of the metrics, given the very uneven and unequal intake of the school, was a form of democratization, a way of putting everyone on the same level. And that really reminded me, as I've often been reminded in my career, how important it is to get the perspective of those who are involved in a system before, as it were, developing one's academic critique, as us academics are wont to do. So the class was published in 2016, and we didn't quite realize that 2016 was a year in which many things changed in the world of datafication, most notably Cambridge Analytica, beautifully coinciding with the GDPR. And in the next project I did, we kind of saw that move really from the instrumentalization of learning and generation of a kind of quantification of practices and discourses into what I suggest is where we are today, which is the move into the datafication of everything and anything, because there's what counts within the school, but also the datafication beyond the school, wherever children are learning, and arguably in one sense they are always learning and acting in some way. So in this project, nicely timed, and now with funding from the Information Commissioner's Office, my colleagues and I went into schools to try to understand now how did a kind of post-GDPR world look to children? What were their thoughts about technology and datafication? And perhaps because Cambridge Analytica had just happened, and we were literally talking to 11-year-olds, explaining to us what all of this meant, and and excited by the drama of it, actually. We kind of felt we were marking that moment when the technologies used in schools were moving from being a tool in the hands of teachers or perhaps students to becoming environmental, to becoming kind of all around and embedded and infrastructural, to the very processes of learning, such that different methods were needed, even to make visible and clear the operation of that kind of technological infrastructure in education. In this case, as you can see by the main picture on your screen, we took a workshop approach, a participatory kind of co-design approach, to trying to understand both what children want to know, what they want to understand about the datafication of their learning, and also what they want to change. And there was a lot that they wanted to change, as we discovered. The second image there is my an image from an advert from Facebook, which really drives me nuts for the way in which it confuses children. It begins with an appealing sentence: "We all have our own privacy settings," and then it tells the child by the default tick that if they wish, they can keep their data to themselves. They don't have to make it public. They don't have to share it with friends. They can keep it to only me. And of course, what Facebook doesn't tell them in that advert is that if they tick that box, it will be kept only to them and to Facebook and to everyone and every organization that Facebook shares their data with. So only me is a really quite extraordinary statement. And that illustrates the finding from the main finding from this research that we did, which you can see the URL there, myprivacy.uk, where we, after listening to children's sense of what is happening with their data, what they want to be happening, we argued that there are at heart kind of three logics in operation. Three types of privacy, if you will. And the one that makes most sense to children, perhaps to everyone, is the idea of privacy in interpersonal settings. In interpersonal contexts where we feel we kind of understand the trust that we have in the others, we have a sense of agency, and we kind of know what our tactics are to kind of manage our privacy according to the relationship and according to our degree of control. And I'd contrast that interpersonal sense of privacy with the institutional one, which is the one that I've become more and more interested in, which is the relationship between the child and, in this case, the school, where there is, again, we heard, a considerable degree of trust. My school will treat my data properly. My school will be ethical. My school would not sell my data. I trust my teachers to know what they're doing. But actually very little agency. So children also said that they have very little control over the data that is collected from them in school. For the school to function, there has to be, as it were, a collective decision about what the school will use and what data it will collect and how it will process that without giving every child a kind of individual opt-out. So there's still the trust, but the agency is gone. And then in the commercial settings, as children were also eloquent about, there is very often neither trust nor agency. And these are makes for a fantastically difficult interaction for children. And underlying those three logics, we can also see three different conceptions of data. So in the interpersonal setting, children primarily, we all, I think, primarily think of data as something that is given, something that we choose to give to the other. In the interpersonal setting, especially in the school, data is largely taken from the child, but they kind of know what's taken. They too sat in that classroom and had an idea of what was being entered into SIMS. It was their attendance, it was their grades, and perhaps it was their concerns about different or choices of subject. And then there's the data that is inferred and profiled, which of course is the lifeblood now of commerce, about which children and I think their parents and often their teachers have much less grasp. What it concerns me about the Facebook advert here and what we saw and what it indicates is a kind of confusion of those different senses of privacy, which is actually adult-led. We confuse children. We talk as if they were only to care about their privacy and control their privacy settings, they would be able to manage that larger institutional and commercial data ecology, even though they patently cannot. And I'll just give you some kind of illustrative quotes of the kinds of ways in which, when they understood the data ecology they're part of, children are concerned about. And the quotes illustrate, I think, two things here. One is that they really don't want business kind of poking through their contacts, as one child said, or others to have access to what they are doing, what they are thinking, what they are reading, and they find that creepy and unfair. But then also they have that sense that if they manage the workarounds, if they put in a false name or go on ghost mode or use a VPN or have multiple accounts, they can subvert it, they can escape it, they can, because the tactics of the everyday, of the interpersonal, will surely also work with commerce. So in that project, we kind of moved from seeing how the data and the quantification in the classroom has become a routine part of the learning process, to that sense of outrage, it's none of their business, at not so much what data is collected, but what is done with it, and the loss of agency and trust that kind of onward data processing involves, and that children and I love that sense that it's none of their business, because as we know, for very many business, it is precisely their business to poke through your contacts and check what you're doing on your computer and track and integrate different kinds of data from you. So it is precisely their business. Well, in that project at myprivacy.uk, we tried to do the rights respecting thing and build children a toolkit that would kind of answer the questions that we've been asking in the workshops with them. They did want to know, where does my data go? What happens if I delete something? Is it really deleted? You know, they have the kind of critical questions, but they don't know the answers. What happens to my data when I die? Actually, a very good question. Who is using it? And then what can I do about it? And we built them a toolkit of resources, and it may be that this audience will have ideas of what I could add to that toolkit. It's a living resource, and I hope it is both useful and also can be added to and improved. But of course, the toolkit can only take us so far. There are things that children can be taught. There are things about the data ecology that they can understand, and there are things that they can't. And frankly, there are things that adults don't understand. And our interviews with both parents and teachers gave us a very kind of clear sense of where some of those limits are. And it made me kind of ask the question, not only what can and can't be taught, but also what responsibility is it fair and appropriate to burden children with, and at what point should the responsibility go elsewhere. And so one question we asked in an article which came out of that project was how much managing the data that is collected in and through children's education can and should be the responsibility of the school. And that's what we explore in the article shown here. So obviously, schools are responsible for GDPR compliance. I'm going to return to that in a moment. Less obviously, but also importantly, schools are responsible, or I believe should be responsible, for education around digital literacy, media literacy, data literacy, though there are some interesting challenges about where that sits within the curriculum, how much teachers and which teachers are trained, for example, to explain to children about their data processing, their data subject rights, the possible benefits and harms that it might result in. That is not quite obvious, and the government, as you may know, has just announced its new media literacy strategy, in which I suggest this should be included, but it's not apparent as yet that it will be. But also, we were interested by the end of this project to explore how much schools can take the burden by themselves being a model of good practice in a way that respects children's rights and data subject rights. So when I talk to, I've talked to a number of data protection officers in schools, I find people who are very conscientious in doing their job, but they haven't necessarily thought that they should explain their job to the children on whose behalf they do it. It's not necessarily, or it's not very often, I suspect, thought of as a kind of a child-facing, public-facing role in which that involves students and parents, perhaps in understanding, but also in making some of the decisions. So is the data protection impact assessment that schools do, is it online? Is it easy to understand? Does it explain both what the school does, but also third-party uses? And does, in fact, the DPO know what all of those third-party uses are? Does it make children's data subject rights accessible to them in a way that they can seek remedy? I hear many concerns that this is not happening. My question really is the kind of normative question: should it be happening? Is this a role? Because my suspicion is that if children understand, if they have that kind of visceral sense of what good data practices look like within their own school, because they've lived them and they've sought remedy and they've felt respected in how they're treated, then they would know what to expect and what to demand of the wider society, and they could perhaps take on a little more of the responsibility. So in a sense, this argument is kind of taking me beyond just thinking about the student perspective to think about the school perspective within the wider data ecology. And that brings me to the work of the Digital Futures Commission, which I shall make my third and last project in the sequence that I'd like to tell you about today. So the Digital Futures Commission was set up last year as a collaboration as led by the Five Rights Foundation, which is a children's charity leading on all matters child rights and digital, with a very interesting and helpful and expert set of commissioners. And it's an applied research project looking to see where and how practical and evidence-based interventions can kind of steer us a little bit to get from where we are today to where we are going as the digital world advances and becomes more complex. And where we're going, of course, is a tricky one to understand, because there are both incredibly kind of dystopian and utopian visions of what that could be. And when I talk to people now, whether I'm talking to an ed tech or technologist or indeed an academic, I can see that there are these kind of very different worlds that we live in. Some of us very optimistic about the possibilities, some very fearful of what could be problematic and what is becoming problematic. So the Digital Futures Commission is adopting a child rights perspective to asking what does good look like? Where do we want to go? And by a child rights perspective, I really mean including a focus on children's best interests, children's interests, to go back to the title of my talk, children's voice. So we began with a report on children and young people's voices about the digital world. And in that report, we heard a lot about their sense of a loss of agency, a lack of agency in relation to all things digital. And we have begun to kind of advocate for some of what good might look like, including, for example, the conduct of child rights impact assessments, which wraps up risk assessments and data protection assessments and so forth within a kind of holistic child rights framework. And in relation to children's education, a child rights framework, I think, raises questions about what we even mean by education. how do we kind of integrate education and privacy, because all the children's rights matter? How do we also integrate children's agency and participation, ensure non-discrimination? And I note Matt said that this conference has just launched its ethical framework, so I'm kind of curious to see how much we're in synergy there. So the Digital Futures Commission has work streams on education, but also on play, and also on developing guidance for innovators, because our focus ultimately is on thinking about design and regulation, precisely to kind of relieve the burden of responsibility from parents and children, and to place it in the hands of those with the power to act, which are government and business. So in thinking about education, we took our lead from a project, in fact, done by Jen Person, called the State of Data 2020, as part of an organisation, Defend Digital Me. And I just give you kind of two illustrations here from Jen Person's work. One, which is to kind of capture the sense that data is being generated in and through a child's participation in school every hour of every day. And of course, it's the power of that data lies in the combination of all of those different data sources. Some of them sensitive, some of them identifiable, but arguably all of them identifiable by the time they've been integrated. And on the right, the orange diagram is her assessment of the present state of governance and kind of management of that data, which, as you can see, is pretty damning. And she identifies kind of layers of problems. And I'll be interested in your thoughts, but the idea that actually definitions of data, including education data, are quite unclear. The responsibility split between schools, Department of Education, local authorities, business is unclear. Who is kind of responsible? The role of the Information Commissioner in terms of kind of audit and oversight, and even the lack of a kind of an overall education data governance framework. And informally, as we've progressed our work, we keep being told that, yes, the management of education, or the governance of education data is in something of a muddle and a mess, and everyone is postponing it as rather difficult. So, of course, data has always been collected in schools, but what do we know now? It's at a much greater volume, much more sharing, much more commercialization. The data processing is much more opaque in terms of who's doing what, and it's very difficult to obtain remedy when something has gone wrong. So Jen Person's analysis is pretty pessimistic, but I'm finding, as we look in the academic research, as I said, this kind of polarization. Is EdTech, is the processing of education data really bringing fantastic new benefits, personalized learning, assistive technologies, more efficient administration, kind of anticipating safeguarding needs? There's a lot of talk about what those benefits might be. But there's also a lot of concern about data which is insecurely kept, routinely breached, a lot of concern about surveillance and loss of privacy, about bias and discrimination in processing and outcomes, and the sheer unknown nature of the kind of future and the future consequences. So now we've switched our methods and our kind of level of analysis from the previous projects I talked about, and we're kind of trying to trace what that data ecology is, who is collecting data generated in school and education, where is it going, in whose interests are served, and whether and when we should be concerned. So this is a Lightbeam screenshot of my colleagues Kriko Potong. She visited Capita Sims, Google Classroom, and Show My Homework. That's the the white S in the black square, just to kind of begin to see where is the data going when you engage with one app, what's that kind of wider ecology. This is just illustrative at present. And we've been interviewing and we'll continue to interview a range of experts in and around this this landscape. And again, I offer an invitation because this work is in its early stages, and I would love to hear from anyone who would like to contribute or has a particular perspective. But we began this work with a legal mapping conducted by Emma Day, who's a human rights lawyer and co-author of UNICEF's new principles, new data manifesto principles on what good ethical processing of children's education data looks like. And the report there, which has just come out, offers a legal mapping focused on the UK and kind of unpicks the layers of complexity that apply, actually, especially in England. Things seem a little more straightforward and streamlined and effective in the UK's other nations. But in England especially, there seems to be a fair bit of confusion and particularly gaps in who has oversight, where remedy is to be sought, and really where the responsibility lies, especially between the public and the private sector. So in that report, we identify all the applicable legislation, and we also build on the state of data report to unpack some of the practices and some of the concerns and confusions, of which one really noteworthy one is what we're seeing as a kind of gradual convergence between two systems that used to be quite separate. One which was with the collection of what we might call kind of national school data, the data that schools are required to collect on children for purposes for the Department of Education and local authorities for planning and tracking educational progress and outcomes. That's kind of has it one set of regulation, and then the other kind of data that is being collected through the routine use of technologies in the classroom and in the home, variously linked through devices, through software and so forth, which has a rather different and much lighter touch form of regulation, essentially the UK GDPR. And quite a lot of confusions about exactly where the responsibilities lie. Tech in the classroom has become the mechanism by which all data is collected, whether it's for public or for private purposes, and drawing those lines are fantastically difficult. So we looked around for some guidance. The government has produced the EdTech strategy, as I'm sure everybody here knows, but it says very little about data processing and datafication of education. And our sense is that there's a very large burden now placed on schools to kind of interpret the law, to choose which EdTech tools are best and appropriate for their schools, and to work out, if they can, their own contractual terms with the different EdTech companies. So it seems an inefficient, perhaps ineffective process in which there is actually a lot of power in the hands of EdTech companies to kind of implement and interpret the regulation as they wish, in ways that are not necessarily accountable, and quite a tricky burden for schools if they wish to make any change or improvement. So I'm going to end on questions because my mind is full of questions, and I hope I've raised some questions also for you to consider. And in the report, we end with kind of 10 recommendations that we think could be implemented now, to do with provision of guidance and clarity and review of procedures and efficient, independent oversight of processes, perhaps provide standard contractual clauses that respect children's data rights when schools make contracts with their tech companies. But I think we're also kind of thinking about the future conceptual and practical challenges. And I thought that's really where I would stop, because to my mind, it is still unknown what data are collected about children, why and who wants it. That seems a very significant question. Much of it, of course, is collected for, quote, educational purposes, but do we agree on what those educational purposes are? Where are we with that long-standing argument between the schools without walls, kind of open, connected learning position, and those who are more concerned with teaching to the test and getting a school up the rankings, to kind of rather crudely polarize different ideas of pedagogy? Do we yet know enough about both the potential harms and the potential benefits of this level, this scale of processing of children's data? And more practically, what is the right way to apportion the responsibilities among the different organizations? And what does good look like? What does best practice look like? And how might we get there? So these are all the questions in my mind. I look forward to hearing from yours. So I'm going to stop. I'll just note that the Digital Futures Commission has been blogging about its work on play, education and innovation. Though in my mind, everything connects. But do visit our blog if you're interested, or indeed you might like to contribute. And I will thank you very much for your attention and stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Really, thank you for that. And looking at the chat, your talk has clearly resonated with lots of people here today. I do have a few questions lined up, if I may. Not your questions, some different ones. So the first one comes from Pete Mellor at the University of Sheffield. And Pete's making the connection actually between schools and then HE later. He's asking, well, it's on the screen there, if younger children are so explicitly trained to concentrate their efforts on what is measurable in data, how does this then impact their attitude to learning when they get to higher education?
It's a great question, and as a higher education educator myself, of course, I have to think that yes, what is happening in schools today will be happening, will tell us something about the expectations of students in universities tomorrow. It is, as a empirical psychologist, that raises to me a new question, a new project. But I think it might be helpful if we saw, perhaps if we thought in terms of digital generations of young people as they come, because even those that I was researching 5 years ago, who were talking about getting their smartphones when they were in late primary, perhaps, or are of a different generation to those who were kind of appified from birth and datafied from birth. And I think strikingly also parents there is a generational factor among parents. So they are absolutely no longer the digital immigrants who know nothing, but they too are, kind of engaging and using their growing tech skills to bring up their children in different ways. So I think, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to the question. I'll say it's an open question, but I think it's an important one. Thank you. I'm going to move to a more practical question in a way now from Moira Sarsfield, who's down the road at Imperial. She asks if you can recommend any examples of easily understandable privacy statements in schools or other educational institutions. I could. I don't think I would name a school here, but we have been looking at the statements from a number of schools, and clearly some have, let's say, prioritized this and put some effort into making their statements interpretable. There's a more lively literature already on privacy statements from companies, and I think there is a lot to be learned there, just about, let's say, put it through a readability index to achieve average age, average reading age of secondary education, not requiring a higher degree to read them. But some of this is difficult, and some of it's difficult because where the data goes is, the bottom line message is, we'll take your data, you have little choice, and then we'll share it where the companies choose, and we don't even know where it goes. if I were to summarize, so there is a difficulty in sharing the message when the truth is itself problematic. So I would kind of like to kind of think at that deeper level, how do we change that relationship between the school, or between the public and the private sector? Sure. Okay, let me just find another question for you. Yes, so a question from Dominic at City University London. He's asking, well, the question's on the screen. Sonia, I'll let you read it. Well, that's is there a utopian direction of travel? I think that's a really crucial question. So I'll go back to the child rights framework. So what would utopian mean? It must mean children have been consulted, actually also their parents, and that they understand what the trade-offs are. I think utopian, or better, what better looks like, must involve clarity over which of these purposes are genuinely educational and which ones are for convenience or for profit or for testing products that may never see the light of day or may never benefit children in the real world. I know there's a huge amount of attention now to the question of algorithmic bias and especially racial discrimination, but other kinds of discrimination too. So utopian must mean eliminating that. So that argument is going on elsewhere, but matters for this sector. And then if there were a body, and perhaps it is the Information Commissioner's Office, that kind of stood up loud and strong and said, we are the place where you can bring your problems and we will address them, and kind of make this a priority, I think that would really help, because at the moment the ICO is kind of looking elsewhere with other priorities, and has said remarkably little about schools, even though that involves every child in the country. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm going to be a bit cheeky now and throw in a comment of my own, or ask you to comment, actually, Sonia, just because although nobody's asked the question, there was a lot of talk earlier in the chat in your talk about the role of teachers and universities lecturers in the kind of data literacy and media literacy education. And I know certainly from my perspective, I'm almost kind of always telling the staff, you must tell your students about this, but then people don't necessarily have the means to do that all the time, or feel they have the expertise to do that. Just wondered if you could expand on that. Well, if there's anyone here involved in teacher education, I know everyone wants things in the teacher education curriculum, but it seems to me this one is important. I think it's in a way it's just waiting to happen. I couldn't say that children go to school desperate to learn about history or geography or French, if you'll forgive me, dear teachers, but I do think they want to know about this. I do think they are kind of hungry minds ready to learn, and I also think they are kind of ready to participate in a reasonably expert conversation. They have observations even from a pretty young age, so it's got to be a win for teachers to engage with children. But, and this is a big but, I don't think we can really hope to teach people to understand about a system in which they have no role. So if what we're doing is teaching them that it is hopeless and that the choices they have are purely cosmetic and nothing fundamental, they will turn off, and what we will teach is disillusion and distrust. So I think we should teach children about the system generally, that's their right, but we should especially focus on where they do have some control, and then we should campaign on the areas where they have insufficient control. Okay, thank you. Another question come in, thank you, on the screen as well, a nuts and bolts question for you. Yes, what do we know about Google and Microsoft from Classroom and Teams? Actually, that is our next bit of the research. What's interesting, and of course there has already been a fair bit that shows, so there are many claims made, for example, about how Google Classroom kind of keeps the data within its parameters and doesn't share it with other data sets that Google has and Google knows. You do get a very different story if you read what's said about Google Classroom or G Suite by comparison with, let's say, how Google speaks to its advertising and marketing world, in which very different kinds of claims are made about pinpointing individuals and their second by second interests and concerns, and I think the in a way, the question is also one of accountability and kind of transparency, because it's actually, you know, they claim some ethical practices. It's just very hard to check on any of those. But I think any software that is both infrastructural in the school and also taken home, and you know, at home devices are shared, not just the child, but everyone else in the family. So there is clearly a huge data grab going on. And informally, I gather that COVID has meant that both Google and Microsoft have collected in 18 months data they thought it would take them years to manage to collect, which is quite scary.
Sure. Indeed, indeed. Thank you, Sonia. I'm just checking the chat, and I think we're running out of time, and I'm running out of questions. Perhaps if anybody's got a quick one and wants to throw it in, then please do. Otherwise, I will thank you, Sonia, on behalf of everybody for such a fascinating talk and such a strong opening to the conference. So thank you very much for coming today and sharing your time and your expertise with us. So thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that. And everyone can email me if they have any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you.